Welcome back to the show. We are so honored today to have John Blackledge with us. He's retired as a deputy chief from Palm Bay Police Department, and he retired in 2013 after 33 years of service. He's worked numerous assignments, including patrol, field training, wildlife, marine enforcement, undercover narcotics, internal affairs, training, patrol supervisor, and senior command. He's the vice president of tactical operations at Bonsbach Easy Lift in Melbourne, Florida. It's an international corporation that supports the military and aerospace industry. John's the co-author of Law Enforcement Leadership, Management, and Supervision, published by Blue 360 Media. He's been in the legal and leadership lead instructor for more than 35 years at Eastern Florida State College Public Safety Institute. He's instructed in various areas of advanced training program. There's much more to say, John, but I'll stop there because we got to get to our conversation, man. Thanks for being on the show.
Absolutely. It's good to be here.
So I think the first thing, John, what I want to get to, and obviously just to sort of give our audience what's coming, I think John and his co-author has written the Bible on leadership, so to speak, and I want to really get into that. But before that, I mean, take us through your journey, Johnny. You've done a lot of things in life, man, in law enforcement and the private industry. Sort of take us through sort of where you find yourself today.
Well, it was, I grew up on the Space Coast. My father worked out at NASA, and my father had 4 boys, and he did a lot of leadership mentoring as a father, Jack Blackledge. And that my personal interest that catapulted into, believe it or not, I was a junior firefighter back in days when they did crazy things like let teenagers ride on the front of fire trucks to put out fires, but eventually became a police explorer from a more organizational perspective in Titusville. And then I ended up, because I had graduated high school a little young, I ended up working ambulance because I couldn't get a police job yet. And get the training, and I ended up at the Game Commission, which is where I thought I would land for the rest of my life. And during my time in the academy, I got recruited to go to Palm Bay, and as you described, I kind of went through all the positions and interests I had there, and I got to that point in my retirement, or in our retirement plan, where it was, you got to leave now. You've hit the maximum numbers and you have to go. And I was recruited to go to Sebastian Police Department nearby to help them develop their staff. And then once I decided, I've had 38 years, I became a reserve at the sheriff's office here. And a friend of mine who is the CEO of the company here at Bonsbach said, hey, since you're retiring, why don't you come work for me for a while? And now I've gotten to see the perspective of leadership in private industry and make those comparisons. So that was kind of the quick jump through the hoops that I went through.
Now, as you talk about leadership, John, I mean, I think I'm in a similar boat as you. I was in law enforcement leadership for 30 plus years, and then I moved to the private sector, and it couldn't be different than night and day. Is that what piqued your interest in leadership? Because when I say interest, I think we're all interested in leadership. That you wrote literally the Bible on leadership. Was this interest, was it piqued in you once you got to the private industry, or were you already sort of thinking about it?
No, that happened a long time early. Very similar to, and while we're talking, you did a great job with your book, and I've read it numerous times. Saw your presentation down in 2021 at Hollywood, Florida, at the Florida Police Chiefs Conference. And my interest in writing a book was the fact that there was not really good resources when I became a sergeant back in the, as I say, but back in the 80s. You went through, the simple couple-day class, a 2-week class the state provided for, which is what I teach now. And there was not a lot of resources. Fortunately, I was very fortunate with Palm Bay Police Department. There was a lot of focus on leadership and growth because the city was exploding. It went from 23 officers in 1980 to it's over 200 now. That rapid growth put us in a focus with good chiefs saying we got to prepare for the future. Around about the time I was promoted to sergeant, and this is in the early 90s. I'm working as a sergeant. A friend of mine who we had hired, he's going through Florida Institute of Technology's psychology program, had been a reserve officer. He said, "You really ought to write a book." And actually the seed was planted. But it wasn't until in the early 2000s, I've spent a lot of time teaching legal. I'm teaching the state curriculum, and to kind of cut it short, the publisher of Blue 360, the CEO said, "I've talked to several people, and they said you're the guy to write a book on this." So eventually, I did work on it. Fortunately, I had a lot of time during the unfortunate circumstances of COVID, and my boss really, Robert Rose, really pushed, "You got to get this done. You're the guy to do this." So the second part of that is I wanted to create something that was not available to me as a sergeant, a lieutenant. We didn't have captains. I went from lieutenant to major and then deputy chief. I wanted something that wasn't out there. There's a lot of great books. There's a lot of good one-timers, my theories and things like that. But I wanted to make the comprehensive manual of how to become a sergeant, figure out, do you want to be a sergeant? Do you want to be a lieutenant? And once I get it, a manual in the field to operate out of. And my co-author, Marshall Jones, who actually I hired is a young guy coming out of the Marine Corps, and he left police work to become a professor at FIT. Combining with him gets the theoretical and the academic ideas on the table. My responsibility is turn it into practice, because even when I was interim chief, I was out stopping cars and working with the troops 2:00 in the morning sometimes. And I kept watching what was going on and teaching classes at the academy and advanced training and hearing the same stories. And I went, there's got to be something for this. So I appreciate your kind comments, because my goal was to have someone like Travis Yates say, "This is the Bible." And I've had great endorsements by Jack Inner and Kevin Gilmore and a number of other people that are the famous names in the business.
Well, you certainly are running around in good circles. Mine's not included, but Jack Inter and Gil Martin, of course, everyone is familiar with. And I'll tell you, I'm just going to give the book here: Law Enforcement Leadership, Management, and Supervision, Blue 360 Media. It's available at all publishers, straight on the website, and of course, Amazon as well. And when you talk about a manual, so to speak, from sergeant all the way through and even officer, I got to tell you, John, when I was started promoting, I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but you're exactly right. There was nothing out there. I literally read, and this is crazy, the biography of LAPD Chief Daryl Gates a dozen times, because there were just small nuggets. Wasn't a lot. More of it about him and this and that, but there were small nuggets. And one of the most, now that I recognize it, it's kind of disgusting things that he recommended in there was, as soon as you get promoted, start studying for the next test, which I thought, that's, looking back, that's not the advice I would give people. Learn the job you're in. Make sure you're comfortable in the job you're in before you even make a decision to go to the next rank. But obviously, he was a very motivated guy, rose to the highest levels of policing in Los Angeles. But there wasn't anything out there. I mean, there just wasn't. It was pre-internet, of course. Now, that's part of the issue, though, and you mentioned it, is we're inundated with leadership resources. And it's so easy to either get steered in the wrong direction or sort of get ADHD and focus on the wrong thing. That's where I think your book thrives. If you get John's book, you don't need anything else. Everything else should be like a supplemental. Like I said, I didn't call it the Bible without a reason. The Bible should be your main book. Use devotionals as what you read on the side. This is the main one, and there's plenty of other books out there that you can use to assist you. And it's just so dense, man. I can't even imagine the effort. And I'm going to ask you about that, because I'm obviously an author as well, and I know the effort that goes into these. Tell me the process that you and your co-author had to have gone through, because when I look at this, I just cringe at the thousands of hours that it took for research and writing and editing. Talk to us about that, because we got some people listening and watching that I'm sure has the same interest in mind to write. Talk to us about your process there.
Well, you're right. It's an arduous task. At the time, I was asked to tackle this by Susan at Blue 360. It was just prior to COVID. And like I said, with the terrible, tragic, unfortunate circumstances of COVID, one silver lining is I was at the company at the time, and we went into a very special mode of having daytime and nighttime shifts. We're a manufacturing company that, again, supports the aerospace and defense industry, among others, medical. So I ended up being at work from about 7 in the morning until about 11 o'clock at night, which was not unusual, having been a cop for 38 years, working 5 days a week. And so I would spend a lot of time writing and focused on that, those parts of the book. But the real difficult part was Marshall and I sitting down, breaking out the pieces, and then him doing his part, me doing my part, and then merging them together. The one piece of advice I'd give anybody, and I suspect you would repeat this phrase, and I have a lot of friends who are authors. One of my former cops wrote Christian murder mysteries. He wrote 5 of them. In fact, they're right back here on this shelf. Danny McKnight from Black Hawk Down and I are very good friends, and I kind of worked with him through writing his book. It's something that what you don't want to have is too much of a time pressure. That really makes it a lot more difficult. So if you can write it on your own terms and timeline, that's in your best interest. The second is get someone that you trust that's going to, as Jack Inner says, and you brought up Jack Inner, he's probably the biggest influence in my life other than my father on leadership is, and I've helped Jack with one of his books, is he'll tell you getting pushed in that time pressure is not the situation you want to be in, but you want someone who's going to tell you the truth, that paragraph sucks. That is not any good. You want a courageous editor, to use your term, to help out with writing it. So I'm very lucky that my wife, who's a retired police commander and prides herself as an English expert, in fact, she wears a T-shirt that says, "I'm quietly correcting your grammar." So she's very good about being straightforward, honest, and saying, this needs to be fixed. Do it again.
Yeah, that's great advice. Because AI is not your friend, because AI wants to get along with you, so it's never going to tell you things typically that you don't want to hear. Now you can prompt it that way, but I wouldn't recommend using AI for any of this process. There's enough of that going on, and it's not great. And as you go through this, John, I'm going to touch on several pieces here, but I'm curious to know your thoughts on, if I was to mention to you, what is your foundation of leadership? What's the things you must have? We're all good in some things and not so good in others, but if you want to start through this leadership journey, what is that foundation that you want people to build on?
It's twofold, and the book speaks to this. The first is you've got to know yourself. And interestingly, I believe part 2 of your book is you better know who you are before you take on being a leader. We actually have a whole chapter on that, and we're about to come out with the 2nd edition in about 2 months. And we beef that up, because if you don't know who you are, and I go through this in line supervision and mid-management class that we teach a couple times every year at our regional academy, is if you haven't figured out who you are, a little bit of that emotional intelligence, first 2 stages, and you need to know that you're prepared for this. The second is our definition of leadership, which comes from an exercise I do in all my classes. And I go, why do people want to get promoted? Why do you want to get promoted? And we end up centering on one key word, and that's influence. If you want to properly influence, and all the other characters like Kuzi and Posner in the Leadership Challenge have this initial part of their book say, we've surveyed thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, and what are the characteristics of good leaders? And very similar to your characteristics of good leaders on page 90 in Courageous Police Leadership, they they combine the things like integrity and compassion and all those kind of things. But at the end of the day, as a leader, those are background issues that have got to be met. Ultimately, you have to want to influence people the right way for the right reasons. I'll add a third that our book focuses on, and what you had said about the book just a minute ago is we're not telling you there's one way to be a leader. Marshall created some police leadership pipeline material that's in the book. There's going to be a lot more in the second edition, and we've spoken all over the country about this. Is you can't become someone you're not. So it's got to be that you become an authentic leader. So we go back to a little bit about what you talked about at Daryl Gates. And I had a very good friend that was a sergeant under Daryl Gates, K9, through my wife's connection doing K9, and that was Sergeant Don Yarnell, who knew Gates very well. While I agree with you, I never focused on leadership until I kind of got my police out of my system. 10 years of work in the field, work in investigations and narcotics and whatnot. I didn't want to get promoted too early. But you can't become somebody different as a leader. So there's got to be authenticity and sincerity, or you become a fraud right off the bat. And, it kind of drives back to a lot of, again, what's in your book, which is one of the reasons we mention your book and ours is, look, are you prepared to be a courageous police leader? Are you prepared to be a we person, not a me person, like Jack Inner talks about in his material?
Yeah, you make a comment in your book, and I love this phrase. You said, correct decisions will not make you popular. And obviously, I talk about that all the time. That's the pure definition of what courageous leadership is, which is you're going to do what's right, even when no one else thinks it's right, and it could hurt you at the end of the day. That's why being courageous is so like a unicorn style leadership. Not many people will do it. They'll be courageous to a point until maybe personally they may get hurt. But I want to get your thoughts on that. There is a right and a wrong way. It's pretty much inside all of us. Even when bad leaders are making bad decisions, they internally know that they're doing that. What would you say to people listening or watching out there when they come up across these difficult decisions they know are right, but could ultimately harm their future career or whatever it is?
Well, I'll illustrate it through a true example. I had a very active officer when I was a night lieutenant, night watch commander. We had a chief leaving the agency. In fact, we had a shooting. It was not a particularly good one. And he was going out the door, and there was an expectation a new chief was coming in. And one of my officers, great DUI guy, has the DRE master's degree of what I call master's degree of DUI. And he arrests a Palm Bay City Council member for DUI, along with some other things that happened. And he calls me and he says, "Hey, I need to let you know about it." And he heard the same line he heard from me numerous times when other things happened like that. And I said, "This isn't going to be fun, but you need to do your job. Do it. Treat him like you treat everybody else," which he did. And I will tell you, without getting into a whole lot of details for the purpose of the brevity of the show, I got drugged through the mud pretty bad. Now, the real courageous police leadership out of that wasn't my example. Is the new chief came on board, who's obviously, quote, a new chief on probation. And he met with me and he said, "This happened about 4 months ago. We're awaiting trial for this still. Obviously, a lot of strategic delays from a legal standpoint." And that chief backed me to the hilt, including when we got blasted in the newspaper. This councilman dragged my wife into the picture, said she couldn't have gotten promoted unless her husband helped her with the test, which was totally false. She had passed the test years before we were around each other. And that chief stuck his neck out. And he said, "I'm going to ask you one time, John, did you do anything to help your wife?" And I said, "Absolutely not." And he said, "I'm going to stake my career on this." And he had come from Orlando Police Department. which is a tight organization, very professional. And he backed me up. And for the next 10 years, he led the agency with that same mindset. And I've had the good fortune of having now Marshal Bill Berger as a chief subsequent to Paul Rumbley, and then Doug Muldoon, who was the chief there in the latter part of my career. So I've had Florida Police Chief presidents, IACP president, FBI NA presidents, and all of them focused on the one factor that means a whole lot. And it's technical skills come and go. And you're going to have, as you know, you've had hundreds, if not thousands of officers working under your command. The human factor in leadership and the integrity and that, and to use the term for the purpose of the show, the courageousness to make the right decisions is massive, in my opinion. If you don't have the honor to risk it, then you shouldn't be taking the job as the chief or the sheriff if you're not willing to back your people up when they've done right.
Yeah, and the power of that story, John, is you not only can still talk about that chief in the light you just did, but I bet the officers of that department still remember that incident and others, because you don't make courageous decisions in isolation. I'm sure there were a number of decisions that chief made that people remember and are fond of. And I can't imagine, a chief is always on probation. The brand new chief who typically works for the city council makes that decision. He knew exactly what he was putting on the line. And that's why we see so much cowardice today, because people care more about themselves than they do about others. And you mentioned something about the media. And obviously the last decade has been just a complete train wreck, the way law enforcement's dealt with the media. And you have a huge section in your book about it. I loved it. But I wanted you to encourage the leaders out there, because nothing's changed, right? This is not new. The media always tends to have a narrative that is not necessarily honest. But it seems like our reaction in the last 10 years to that dishonest narrative has changed. Instead of correcting the lie, we tend to sometimes either go along with it or don't say anything. And I think it's done tremendous damage to the profession that I think we're still crawling out of. What's your thoughts on media relations and how leaders should deal with that?
In the book, you had mentioned the media chapter. In fact, I just reviewed that for the second edition edit last weekend. And the chapter that's in the book on that, chapter 22, I wrote with a former reporter I used to butt heads with, Yvonne Martinez. And lo and behold, a new chief comes onto the department, is Bill Berger, and he hires Yvonne from the TV news stations after she worked at the sheriff's office for a while as PIO, as our PIO. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me, And we've since become extremely good friends. She teaches the media portion of some of my leadership, the media portion of my leadership classes up at the academy. And I learned, and the line I have in the book is, you have a choice. You can either feed the bear, the media, or you can let the bear come hunting for food. And I'm an outdoorsman, and my roommate at the FBI NA was an Alaska state trooper that told me all about polar bears and how dangerous they are. Well, the media's become the polar bear. It doesn't just wait to nab you. It'll come after you. And what I have found is you've got to have some kind of constant, ongoing developmental relationship, because something's going to not go right one day. You're not going to have control. We had a mass shooting in Palm Bay in 1987. Lost two of our officers. I was on scene for the latter part of that. You're going to have officer-involved shootings that things aren't going to go perfect. Car crashes where pursuits that go bad, etc. And if you don't have that ongoing dialogue and connection, so if you go back to what you'd asked before, a foundational issue is establishing a relationship with the media. In my opinion, you constantly feed that. And I learned a lot from Bill Berger about public image in media, because he was a master at that side of the business.
Yeah. I think it's so vital. I think you're so correct. It's almost like deposits and withdrawals, right? You better keep making deposits into those relationships because you may have to write a big check one day. We work in a gray area. Things That's why lawyers circle police departments. They know that on any given day something's going to go wrong or something's going to be perceived as wrong, and they can jump in. And that's just the way it is. And so I don't think we should run from that. We should understand that, like you just described, and be prepared for that. And I think that's the best way to do it.
Yes, that's your statement about the next level of the circling isn't the media, it's the lawyers that are looking to make money. And of course, like a lot of things, my joke is I have friends that are lawyers, but
one of the things that I see can really supercharge a culture of an agency, which then in turn helps recruiting and retention and everything else, is empowerment. You obviously have a huge section on that and the importance of that. I just want you to talk briefly about how anyone at any rank can implement that, because I think sometimes we can sometimes have an us versus them mentality, not just with the public, but with the people inside our agencies. And we're sometimes scared, and we sort of have this joke. Of course, if it's a joke, it's real, which is information's power, right? Information's control. But I have experienced and seen other people experience that if you give that up and you empower and you trust other people, amazing things can happen. I don't care whether a first day rookie or a veteran that maybe didn't have the greatest reputation. If you empower them with things to do, oftentimes that turns out very positive. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, you're right on point. I had the academy students the very first week of the academy for what's called intro, and then I have them for 2 weeks right after that for almost a full 2 weeks doing the legal block covering constitutional law and procedural law and use of force and all that. And again, the academy is not an educational program. It's a training program. I tell them, if this was education, we'd send you home with a book and have you take a test at the end of 2 weeks. This isn't math or algebra. It's not humanities. We're training you to operate in our world, and you need to adapt to that. And this is, again, I started teaching in 1987 at the academy level, and I had Vietnam veterans that were retiring out of the service in their 30s and 40s, becoming cops at that time. And the difference with the generation that I have in 2025, I have a class starting in a couple weeks, 4 or 5 classes a year with 30 kids in it. The number one thing I tell them is you've got to learn to operate in our world. And that means you got to do 2 things you're not used to doing. You got to communicate and influence people through that communication. And of that, you've got to lead. Because when you pull up at a traffic crash, you might be 19 years old and you walk up on a traffic crash and there's 6 people, 3 of them are injured severely, 2 of them are in distress because their family members injured. Everybody turns and looks at you to go start leading and solve this problem. So your leadership's got to be evident starting in the academy through FTO and right out of the chute when you hit the streets on your own. So yes, I agree with that. And there's a key element is if you think you might want to get promoted one day, which most of us don't know that. I never dreamed I would have ended up anything past lieutenant when I was starting. I was 19 years old. And would I have maybe acted a little differently? I thought, yeah, but then I wouldn't have had as much fun. But, the reality is kind of like what Gates said. You got to start thinking about that. You just don't act like you're chasing it. Your wise sage advice of we say that in the book. Think about it, but right now worry about doing this job right and well.
Yeah, I tell you what, if you're just now joining us, we're talking to John Blackledge, former deputy chief. He's written the book, Law Enforcement Leadership, Management, and Supervision. You have to get this book. It's not just for law enforcement, but it's just leadership in general as well, because he's got incredible experience both in law enforcement and the private industry. And John, what do you see as the big difference in law enforcement leadership versus private industry? I actually see great leadership not being different, but obviously we approach things differently. What's your thoughts on that since your experiences in both places?
Probably the first thing I noticed when I started with the company, my buddy Robert Rose, who's the CEO and president of the company, he took it in 25 years from a failing company he walked into to we're having a stellar year this year, and we've had nothing but growth into the tens of millions of dollars. I was amazed sitting in management meetings, things that we would talk about in police work, like we ought to add a position to cover this, would have meant talking about it, doing a study, putting it into a budget proposal.
Don't forget the committee. Let's get a committee together.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes. And, you know, all of this process that went on, and then you'd throw it into the budget and hope the city manager would accept it. And it would go to the city council, and they'd grill the chiefs, and, you know, want to see 20 pages on, you know, a review of it. And in private industry, Robert sits there and goes, okay, well, we'll put out a thing tomorrow. We'll hire someone. And I'm like, holy cow, how do you do this? Our ability to be agile and react to what happens day to day is astounding to me. The other is obviously, and we're in Florida, which is a right to work and at will state. Dealing with problematic employees is, you know, my joke, and I think it's in the book, to terminate a permanent employee in law enforcement, you have to have an act of Congress signed off by God himself. And it better be laden with a whole lot of paper. We're in private industry. Now, I will tell you that we happen to have a boss that's very generous and very forgiving. We deal with a lot of people here with disabilities. He brings on a lot of folks that have special needs and things like that, and work with them. And he's very forgiving, but at the same time, he preaches accountability and ownership. And you know, it's a different way of doing business. So not only the procedural stuff like budgeting and wanting to get something, or we need a piece of equipment that in law enforcement would have taken 2 or 3 years to get in some cases, that you go, we really need this. And he's like, we'll go buy one. But the other is the human factor. We're able to do some things. Now, the other difference is we manufacture products and sell it. And I'm bought into what we do. What we make keeps people safe in aircraft and fighter jets and tanks and save people's lives in some cases. So to me, there's an altruistic side of it, but I can see where in private industry, unlike being a dispatcher or a road officer, a detective, where reality, you can see, man, I'm really making a difference. I've taken a bad guy off the street. I've taken a guy that's selling fentanyl out of the community. It's sometimes motivating our employees can be a different kind of a challenge. You know, you have to find and inspire or quote influence them from a leadership standpoint as to what they want. And at the end of the day, and I hate to say it this way, but government's going to be in business no matter what happens. It's always going to be in business. In private industry, if you don't make money and you don't have an efficient operation, and I've watched Robert walk through the building, and I've asked him, I said, what's going through your mind? And I know what's going through his mind. If I don't run this place well, people don't have a job, don't feed their kids, and don't pay their mortgages. And it's a very different perspective. I've been here 8 years. So you do have to motivate people in different ways.
Yeah, it does. It is very limiting in law enforcement, because I sort of laugh when I hear an agency, oh, we're going to get a new RMS, we're going to get this new technology. And I'm thinking, by the time you get that approval, it's already outdated. Of course, you see that all the time, right?
Yeah.
But if you're right, in private industry, you almost have to be on your toes constantly. There's no room for error, because you won't exist if you're not successful. Law enforcement, if you're not successful, you still get your full budget the next year typically, right? I mean, so I do think that I do think there's good and bad, but I actually have enjoyed leadership in the private industry because of what you just said. You can make very quick decisions, you can pivot quickly, and you don't have to wait to, get 10 or 15 people on your side before the decision gets made. And so there's a huge benefit in that. With that said, if you pivot quickly, your pivot better be correct, because you don't have much room for error. So we're coming to the end here, John, and you have a great section in your book called The Leaders Go Back. And I just love the idea of it. And I can't recommend enough that no matter your rank, man, this is the manual you need. You can, I mean, literally, before this interview, I was literally like just kind of flipping the page and putting my finger on something, and then it just found myself engrossed. Typically I do it with scripture, but I mean, I'm like, so there's not really a section in here that you have to struggle through. Like I put my finger on something like, oh, that's interesting, but I got to keep the interview as short as possible. But the section on the go bag I thought was so fascinating because it's just these quick tips on what you can do right now. And I want to sort of end the show with you talking to the audience and saying, here's 3 or 4 things right now. If you're not doing, get after it.
Well, at the end of every chapter, we have your tactical belt, which is things that you need right away, things that you have to have at your fingertips all the time. And then there's your tactical vest, and then the leader's go bag. And we're actually adding in this second edition. Again, it's coming out in January or February. That's called the wellness kit. So we're integrating, the scourge of our business, which is the depression, suicide, alcoholism, and other types of issues that we see compounding and having tragedy in our business. So we're adding those in every chapter also. Probably the 3 biggest keys, and if you look through the book, you'll see it at the end of every one of the sections. It says, protect the brand. In the book, I talk about, I coined the term organizational maturity. It's similar to emotional intelligence by Dan Goldman, but basically it's, do you have the organizational maturity to balance the needs of the organization, what ultimately has to exist, and the needs of the people that are working for you, and find a way to pull those together. And each one of those leader go bags are focused on one of 3 things: your development, the development of your people, or supporting the organization, and protecting the brand by not just your police department or sheriff's office or state agency, but the profession in its entirety. Because we know that one bad action by a cop ends up worldwide causing demonstrations and riots.
Incredible stuff, John. People are going to be interested in this. They're going to want to be able to reach out to you. I know you do a lot of speaking on the country as well. How can they reach out to you?
They can get a hold of me at blackledgeenterprises.com, or I'll give to you my email address and phone number, and you can post that as part of the show.
Okay. John Blackledge, thanks for being here. Thanks for your time. Thanks for all you've done for the profession and will continue to do. And if you've been watching and you've been listening, thank you for spending your time with us today. We'll see you next time.